What up, everyone? Well, I wanted to do a pre-intro to the intro to the podcast about my 5 things. I think this podcast was actually recorded on Wednesday night. So a couple things have changed. And the video was coming out Friday. The regular podcast came out Wednesday night. So that's why I wanted to update the video part of it, because I talked about a couple things that are now outdated. 2 things real quick. One is Bobby Wagner has actually resigned, as I'm sure you know by now, a 1-year deal. And then also Christian Kirk, whom I mentioned as a guy like, hey, would they be interested in him because of his ties to Cliff Kingsbury? Well, he was traded from the Jaguars to the Texans on Thursday, so you can strike him from the conversation. A lot of moving parts at this time of the year, so I'm going to try and keep you guys up to date as much as I can on the podcast and the video. All the other stuff, go to ESPN.com, etc. Anyways, that's the pre-intro to the intro. Now, here's the real podcast. Enjoy, and thanks a lot. Hello and welcome to my podcast. Do me a favor, subscribe to the John Keim Report wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. You can find us there as part of Ampire Media, Ampire. Always much appreciated when you tune in. Don't forget you can read my work on ESPN.com. And next week, as free agency heats up and gets going, you can check ESPN.com for analysis of every move they make or all the free agent signings they make from Washington and every other team in the NFL. So we got you covered with all that information, and check back on Twitter for all the news, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So today I'm going to do my 5 things I think, and just one little thing before I get going. There will be another podcast this weekend because I want to kind of cover a lot of bases before we get to that Monday negotiating period, which starts at noon on Monday. So, because a lot of things are going to be flying at that time. I normally would come out with the podcast on Monday, but my feeling is by the time it gets to noon, it's going to probably be a little bit old. So let's do one for either Saturday or Sunday. And, we'll just see what happens, because there'll probably be a few things that happen over the weekend as well, maybe some re-signings. So it's going to be a busy period. But I'm going to try and I just want to bring some more information to you and whatever I learned, and bring some people on who know a lot more nationally, especially as well, and how things might shake out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So stay tuned for that. And I will be doing a lot of stuff next week as news warrants. I do think there will be a flurry of signings, whether sometimes it's going to be re-signings. I think they'll be very active. What that means as far as the high-end level, I don't know, but they will be active. So anyways, but I'm going to start with my 5 things, and I'm going to look back at the trade from last week. I think Deebo Samuel will be on his best behavior in Washington. So that's not to say he was this problem child in San Francisco. That's not what I mean by that. I think we all saw what happened on the sidelines this year. We know that he can sometimes get frustrated with the plays or whatever and do all that. But the reason I say that is, first of all, when I talk about it being a low cost transaction because it's a 5th round pick, his salary is $17.5 million. That right now is like 19th in the NFL for salaries at wide receiver. By the end of free agency or after some more signings or whatever, it's going to be even lower, because that's how this works. So you're taking a chance on a guy for 1 year it's certainly not a high end cost, not a low end cost, kind of in the middle, maybe a little bit above for sure, but not an exorbitant cost for a guy of his talents. If you got in the open market, if you sign him in that way, maybe you get him for a little bit less. It's not a whole lot less. So that's why I say, but because of all that, it's why you haven't seen an extension to this point or heard much talk about that at all. Because I think you're going to, like, if I'm Washington, it's like, hey, they know this. Trust me on this. Like, they know they've got him in a good spot, where it's like, if nothing else, you get him on the absolute best behavior coming into camp in a certain way. And I know Nick Wagner told us on the podcast that he came into camp last year in really good shape. And that's something that's followed him around. And that's one of the rumors that are out there about one of the topics that are out there regarding him is always the weight. How bad it is. I mean, the guy runs physical, the guy plays physical, he plays fast, so whatever. But my point is, like, you're going to get a guy that's going to come in to be on his absolute best. Like, whatever stuff is out there, whether it's fair or not, it's out there. So he's going to want to change the narrative. The other part is, if you keep him on that 1-year deal, he's playing for a new contract. He'll be 30 years old when his contract's up. You have one more shot at a really good payday. That's it. So you need to make sure this year counts. So I think, like I said, you add all that stuff up, and I think it's why I think it's why I continue to say it was a good move because of all those reasons. And, you again, you got him for a fifth round pick. And I'll get into more of that about some other receivers who are now available. Anyways, on more in Deebo, everybody you talk to just still says he's a good fit for what these guys want to do. So there you go. Anyway, number two, you still need to add that to that receiver room for sure. And some of that, let's start by who they could resign. Clearly, number one to me would be Noah Brown. I don't anticipate a much of a market for him considering his injury history, but also coming off the kidney issue that he had this year. But he's a really good fit for what they want to do. He was very productive for them. He too played physical. He gives you that big guy down the other side. They don't have another bigger target, and he can play bigger than what he is. And I think that would be a really good move for them. And I would expect that to happen. I just don't anticipate much of a market for him because of the injury history and because, again, of the kidney. But I think he could really help what Washington wants to do. And if nothing else, I would still add somebody in free agency or in the draft, but I think he gives you more options at that position for sure. De'Ami Brown, certainly, I'm sure you've heard a lot of stuff about him testing in the market. That's my expectation for him is to test the market. That's what I heard even a few days ago or several days ago. For sure that's the likely scenario is that he would test it. Would they take him back? I think so, but I think that, he may get something more than what they want to pay. And so he may, but I do expect him to test the market. How high the price goes, it's really hard to say. I know I don't know that it's going to be some exorbitant cost, but it may be more than what you would want to pay De'Ami Brown. I think De'Ami offers you something. He can play physical. We saw him be more productive in the playoffs. Did not like the fumble, but other guys fumbled as well. And I think that's, so he certainly, one of the things Cliff Kingsbury talked about too with him is he became more professional in terms of his route running, his approach, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's beneficial to him as he enters free agency. And he was productive. So, and he made some big plays, man. He made some tough physical plays. Some of those plays that you got from him, you can get from Deebo Samuel now. So you don't necessarily have to do that kind of a move. I would, Olamide Zaccheaus definitely would bring him back. He's the guy that Dan Quinn likes. And I know that he's a guy that they've talked about that they've had discussion with bringing back. I don't know where it stands as of right now, but I would expect, by the time this comes out, maybe somebody's already resigned. Certainly within the next several days, I could see a few of those guys resigning. So, but I would definitely bring back a couple of those guys. Jamison Crowder, why not? You get a guy that can add depth, can run. He's a good slot route runner, and he's a returner. So he's not going to cost you much, and he'd certainly competition at the position, if nothing else. And, so I think that would be a good thing too. And by the way, with a guy like Noah Brown, and somebody brought this up on the one of them, I can't remember where it was. Maybe it was on, I don't know if it was Twitter or if it was in the YouTube comments about the injuries this year and how they were really good with taking care of that. And this kind of relates to a guy like Noah Brown because the injury that slowed him this year was a kidney issue. That's not something that you can really plan for, right? You train your way into not having that. Soft tissue injuries that can go back to training. Other injuries can go back to training. Kidney does not. So I'm bringing up the training stuff because in the NFLPA survey, much better grades for the Commanders this year as opposed to the past where they got like failing grades. But part of it is there are a couple things that I thought were improved this year that help the injury situation and a guy like a Noah Brown to stay healthier, or Deebo Samuel, whomever, more training tables, but also more training staff to work with guys. That's important for recovery purposes, right? And I think I've talked to you about this before, but there were guys in the past, some big name players who would show up late for treatments and they'd get, instead of a 35, 40-minute session, which you need, they get a 10-minute session and you don't, and they would get hurt. And so, or they wouldn't take care of themselves the right way. So when you have more beds, more training staff, I think then when you have a coach who emphasizes it, that too makes a difference. So Dan Quinn was really good at helping them take care of their bodies, whether it's through resting, not just resting on a Wednesday or something like that. A lot of coaches do that. But for example, on Thursday, he'd have a recovery period where these guys are now forced to go get treatment if they need it. So you're getting that treatment. You're getting that allotted time for that. Typically, his recovery period time would have been when we were in the locker room talking to them. But because they had practice, they do a recovery time, then we would go in after at that time or they would, they would make guys available who, um, they would make a handful of players available to us who we didn't get on Wednesday, but they also knew they were going to come, so they'd take care of the recovery period as well. So in other words, the recovery period it was a big emphasis, and I think it also helped explain why they didn't have a ton of injuries and certain types of injuries. Some it's just concussion, some of the ACLs, or what happened to Sam Cosmi, you just can't. That's bad luck. But other stuff you can absolutely help. And I think they did a good job with that. And that's why a guy like Noah Brown, while he may have that injury history, the kidney thing I don't put in there, but maybe it's why he could have a better run here given that training table situation. So just wanted to bring that up. Number three, I think you need to get another wide receiver in here, maybe on the open market. So I know the big names out there right now, DK Metcalf, Devontae Adams. I don't see those. And while it'd be a big splash move, I don't see why you would. They have a lot invested in Terry McLaurin. They just invested a little bit more, obviously, in Deebo Samuel. And I think you could still, and you're going to bring back some guys, and you want to sign some other positions. I think offensive line, defensive line are an absolute must. Now, offensive line, I like what they have in a lot of ways, but I do think you can add one more piece. Could you do two? Could you get a right tackle? Sure, but you don't. I don't know that they feel like they have to get that right tackle. But I do think if you can, when you hear like Dan Quinn talk about Brandon Coleman, they're not necessarily committed to him at one spot or another. So I think it's like go get a guy if you can, right? If you can get a good left tackle, go get him. You can get a good guard, go get him, and add more competition in the room. But I do think I think that should be a priority, is getting at least one guy there, and then defensive line bolstering that, especially at end, and getting another, maybe a run stopper in the middle. But I'll get to more of that in a minute. But I think at receiver, when you look at that, obviously DK Metcalf now wants out. But the problem with a guy like that, as good as he is, we know he'd be good, but you already have a big time. You have a guy on the other side, Terry McLaurin, who's going to get a lot of catches. Or how much are you? This is not. So is that you? Then you have Deebo Samuel, you want to get the ball. You have Jaden Daniels who's going to obviously throw, but also run. I think they want to get a running back in the draft. So I think you're going to have to look at like what would be available for him. Clearly, he'd be really good. We know that. But then it's the cost involved, the cost of the trade. It's not going to be a fifth round pick to get him. I would be surprised by that. But then also he wants a contract extension. Then he becomes more expensive. You already have a really expensive receiver in McLaurin whom you want to extend. So it would be really hard to see them investing that in that position, because the other thing is they were highly productive with what they had last year, and a lot of that goes back to Jaden Daniels and then Cliff Kingsbury. So, anyways, and I think the same goes true for Devontae Adams. With those guys, how would he be? Would he be happy with Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel taking a lot of stuff away from him? I don't know about that, but I think again, it's the commitment to it would be very difficult. But could you go get a guy like a Darius Slayton? Darius Slayton has done a nice job in his career being a deep receiver. Is averaging, what did I have? He averages 15 yards per reception. That's the fifth best yards per catch since he's been in the NFL. So he entered the NFL in 2019. He averaged 15 yards. That's number 6 in that time since he's been in the league. So that's really good. He would add that speed, and I think he'd fit in well with this locker room. So I think I don't know if he's a guy to watch now. I just think he's a guy who you can bring up because he would make some sense given what they might want there. Christian Kirk is another one. We talked about this before, like the Jaguars are going to release him. He has familiarity with Cliff Kingsbury. Kingsbury loves him, raved about him when he signed with Jaguars because he had him in Arizona for 3 years. So that's something in the familiarity clearly helps. Kirk, though, is coming off a couple injury-filled seasons, would lower his price. That's going to be a key. Now, the other part of that is he can obviously be a very effective slot receiver, and that plays into something I'll get to later on. But I also want to talk about the numbers here because first of all, like Deebo Samuel is not necessarily an outside receiver, not necessarily a slot receiver. He's an offensive weapon. So I don't think it would not be a case of you're getting the same kind of situation or getting a guy who's only going to run from the slot or whatever. So, for example, Deebo Samuel has run out of the slot. I have all the routes number. He's run 660 routes out of the slot. He's run 1,500 routes when lined up wide left or right. He has 224 catches when he's wide left or right, 127 when he's in the slot, 28, by the way, when he's out of the backfield. Christian Kirk has had almost 1,600 routes out of the slot, 237 catches, wide right or left, 1,300 routes. So he can do both as well, but it gives you some of that flexibility. He has 156 catches when lined up wide or left or right. When he was with Kingsbury, he ran 748 he had 748 snaps out of the slot, not routes, snaps. Same with all these numbers, not routes, it's snaps. 748 snaps out of the slot, 114 catches. Um, he had with, and that was again with Kingsbury. He had more than 1,000 snaps out when lined up wide, and 116 catches out there. So it just gives you an example of like, that they can both move around and they can both you can use them in multiple ways. Samuel, though, to me is an offensive weapon more than he is just a specific place on that in that route area. So, anyways, so that's one thing, and I think like that's it. They both would give you something, and then Kingsbury knows Kirk. That's obviously going to be that always matters to these guys. One of the things that Adam Peters will talk about is it's more about everybody can watch his skill. It's more about does the person fit here? That has to matter. And I think both those guys would if they wanted to go that route. And I don't know that they will, but I just throwing their names out there because both of them make sense for what they may want. Getting another guy who can run deep routes like Slayton, go with McLaurin. You got Noah Brown coming back. You got a couple guys who go deep. You got Samuel who can be very effective on underneath, intermediate as well. And so that would open up some areas for him and then for Zach Ertz, assuming you sign him. So, anyways, there you go. That's the thinking there. Um, Number four, let's take a look. I think a lot of guys are going to come back, and I think Bobby Wagner comes back. I think it would take. When I was talking to Joe Corey about this, thought it would take about 10 million or so to get him back. I don't know for sure what the number is. Bobby Wagner's agent knows. Bobby Wagner's his own agent, but I do know he likes it here, and I think it matters. He's got a very good relationship with Ken Norton Jr., the linebackers coach, Dan Quinn, Jaden Daniels. And he and Frankie Louvu are pretty tight. I think that matters as well. Now, what happens if he doesn't come back? Well, I think one of the reasons why I know they would like him to come back for at least another year is I think that Jordan McGee is eventually the guy that they hope can ascend to that role. It would be good to have him another year with Bobby Wagner playing behind him, learning from him and learning the game. And then maybe next year at this time, we're talking about is Jordan McGee ready to ascend to that role next to Frankie Louvu? Anyways, Zach Ertz, I would expect him back. There's been dialogue, nothing done yet as I talk, but I know that both sides want to be back in business together. He really likes Kingsbury's offense. We've talked about that before and how this is a guy that he had hoped to end his career with. Now, money always matters, but he also loves playing with Jaden Daniels and knows what he has meant for him. And I think he likes how Quinn has helped take care of his body. So I think there's a lot of things that work in favor for him returning. And these guys know for sure that what he offers and they want him back. So Jeremy Chin, same way. I think he could be a little bit more interesting one. Safety's always weird in free agency. I'm not sure what he's going to command. But you look at Cam Curl last year, people were throwing out crazy numbers. He didn't come close to that. So what will Jeremy Chin get? And he's a really good fit in this defense. That size gives him the ability to play the hybrid spot. I could see him getting a multi-year deal. I know it definitely sounds like they would like him back, but I don't know yet where that one is going. And I know that and I may have more of an update for you sometime over the weekend about where that one might be headed. But he's a guy certainly that they would like back. Jalen Holmes, another guy that they would like back, was a good backup for them. St. Juice, doubtful, I would say, to return. Noah Benogany, I think he did a nice job. I would bring him back just for corner depth, unique corner depth. They don't really have it outside of, they have two guys. I think I would go get another one, whether draft, free agency, because you need somebody opposite Lattimore. There is some optimism in that building for Lattimore about what he can do. Give him a full camp, get further away from that hamstring injury, etc. So, but you're still going to need another guy. Get Sanders still inside, and then I think you get more of what you want from that defense. But I would bring back Igbenogany for depth. Cleveland Farrell. I think if you want a defensive end, I think you can let him go. You got Jalen Holmes, you got Javante Jean-Baptiste to develop. And I think you'd be okay there. John Bates is going to be definitely one to watch because he's a guy, and I've talked about this a little bit, but he's going to be an interesting one. These guys definitely want him back, but I'm going to be curious to see what other teams might do if he gets the open market. because not a lot of guys can block like he can in the open field, in line, out in space against having to block defensive ends. It's really hard to block defensive ends for any tight end, right? So that's always going to be tough. Not many can do it, but John Bates has a reputation around the league as a guy who can do it. Not many like him. That's why I think his services could be um, desired, because he offers teams something that it's hard to find. So but that's going to be the one to watch. Clearly, they would like him back. I mean, they really like him. He's very good in the room. He and Zach Ertz, especially in that room, just their approach, etc. So I think that's going to be interesting. So anyway, I think another thing is the tip off to how they view some of these players, right, is going to be what kind of moves they make in free agency, whether it's bringing back Zach Ertz because maybe you don't think Ben Sinnott is ready, and I don't think that. Listen, you can take you. They can say what they want. Like, the actions speak louder, right? His snaps went down dramatically. He played 40 snaps against the Saints in December. His next, however, I think it was 7 games, he didn't total, I think it was like 28 snaps. That's that's not great for how they viewed him down the stretch. And I think, there are certainly some traits there that are really good. He's physical, but he's not like Zach Ertz. Now, does he just need more chances or more reps? I think you've got to earn that too. And I think that's one thing that's where we're at with Sinnott. He's got to earn more. If I'm them, am looking for another young tight end in the draft just to throw more competition in that room, because I don't know that after 1 year, I'm not sure you can say, oh, give Sinnott another year, then he can replace Zach Ertz next year. I'm not sure we're at that point yet, so I'm going to bring another guy in there and to just for more competition, if nothing else. So I think there are things, again, the reason they like him. He is physical, but when you watch like a guy like Zach Ertz run and move, Sinnott is a very different tight end. And one reason I love watching Ertz play is because I think there's just a savviness to his game that you just don't always see. The way he presses the leverage of the defensive backs, the head, the way he used, how he uses his head when running routes just to throw off some of the routes, but just the patience he runs with. But there's just a lot of that subtle stuff. I told someone it's like watching a guy at the YMCA in a pickup basketball game, the older guy who still can get open, still can make shots. And people are like, how did he do that? Well, I think that's Zach Ertz. Little example, like for when Jordan Reed was here, they would talk to him about pressing the feet of the defensive back. Like when it was a defensive back covering, because he had a hard time when the D-back started covering him because they're quick. So he would break off his route way too early, like at 2 yards early. They tell me, get up on his feet, get up on his feet. That's what Ertz does. Watch him against when he's covered by a defensive back. He still knows how to get open because he presses the leverage. He gets up on their feet and he makes it hard for them to react. So I think like little things like that are really big, but it's why he's such a good security blanket for Jaden Daniels. And you look at like Johnny Newton. Johnny Newton, it's funny because once the John Allen stuff hit, and I still expect him to be cut, I don't know that anybody's going to trade for him. I think if there was any real interest, I think it would have happened by now. I definitely think teams are expecting him to be cut. So that's where we're at with that. But Johnny Newton, then the reason why I wouldn't have spent big on a Milton Williams or the guy from Osa from Dallas, who is, obviously staying there, is because I think Johnny Newton can do what they're doing. I would look for a bigger guy to come, or another big guy to play maybe a one technique kind of guy. I think Johnny Newton can be a good 3-tech guy. But he did a nice job in the playoffs. Like I went back and watched all the snaps in the playoffs, and there's a quickness there. There's a relentlessness there. I think, I saw an improvement in how he handled double teams. And like early in the year, he would try to take on 2 guys. As the year went on, sometimes the guy blocking down, but he would take on 1 guy. So he's not allowing himself to be moved by 2 at one time. He's taking on 1 guy. Much better job there. Now, sometimes, because you'd see sometimes guys peeling off of him. Sometimes it's the design of the offensive line, the blocking, but sometimes it's just the way he handled it better. There were times I also thought like, hey, that quickness would have helped if you have a stronger edge setter on the outside. It would have either allowed him to force something back inside where he's coming inside, or bubble the run outside, and he can help with Bobby Wagner, whomever, chase it down outside. That little bubble could give him extra time to get over there. But you did see a lot of that. There's definitely a lot of stuff to build on with him. I think he still will be a better pass rusher. I know they're excited about him. You heard Dan Quinn talk about guys who could really elevate year one to year two. I think he's one of them for sure. But I think I would get the couple things like sometimes with his leverage, when you see him lose against guys and get him moved back a little bit, he's getting a little bit too upright. And when you could just when you watch him play, like you see them where the helmet is. If his helmet's a little bit lower than the other guys, probably going to win. Either hold the block and get off. He had a couple of plays like that against Detroit where he got a tackle for a loss or a stop, or did a nice job on a play where maybe it messed up somewhere else, but he did his job. So I think there's a lot to build on there, but that's a good situation of you can cut John Allen because you have a young guy who developed in the first year and showed enough to become a guy that you can count on in the second year. And again, I'd still go out and get someone else, but I think that's a good situation they have. And then again with Sinnott, I brought up the snaps. Actually, it was 26 snaps after that Saints game, and I think sometimes guys still have to learn how to do everything at a professional level, and I think that's where we're at. I think with him, they just how do you get better in all ways, and what things do you do? So I think that's something where that's why it's beneficial to have a guy like Ertz and Bates in that room. It's all those young guys have to learn that. And I think that's where, so can he grow? Sure. He can go out and show it he can go to camp and maybe he does a lot better. But I think that's why having Ertz and Bates there will be good for all those young guys. But I'd still bring another one in, maybe in the middle of the draft, something like that. Um, and then there's Luke McCaffrey. If you go out and get Kirk, what does that say for McCaffrey? Well, again, I look at the snaps. First 10 games, each game he had 20 or more snaps. Last 10, only 2 times did he have 20 or more snaps. He had 4 of 12 or less. So there are things that he's got to do better as well, because for both those guys, things you got to do better. And I think like that's something that you want to pay attention to, is how do they do that? And I think McCaffrey, he's lined up outside, he can go in the slot. I think they feel like there's some versatility there, but I think he's got to get that done. But I think that's where having you know that's why I think, like, could you make a move with that slot position? Perhaps. I would still look for another guy from the outside, whether it's free agency or the draft, just to again bolster that room and give Jaden Daniels more weapons and just more depth. Because I think they did a pretty good job this year with that, McLaurin and all that. But I would still want someone else. It'd be nice to have a good young receiver to build on, just to, because Terry's going to be 30, man. You want to have some good young guys in the pipeline. But if not, bring in someone else. And I think Slayton's still young, and Kirk is only 28. So, I think there's still some guys to look at. But anyways, I'm starting to ramble. I'll be back this weekend. I'm not sure which day, if it's Saturday or Sunday, and with another episode talking more about free agency as we get closer and closer and closer to a period that's going to be very busy. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll talk to you next time.